But what's nice about Bitcoin's design is it's parallelizable. So all Bitcoin transactions can be validated in parallel. We can check let's say my node gets 100 different transactions. I can check all of those digital signatures with different CPU cores. If I had 100 CPU cores available, I could check 100 digital signatures at the same time. So that's why I say the UTXO model is highly scalable, because it's highly parallelizable like that.
This podcast is sponsored by Coin ATM Radar. When buying crypto with cash, an ATM is much more reliable and safer than meeting some random person in a random place. And unlike an exchange, which could freeze your account, you truly own all the crypto you buy. With Coin ATM Radar, you could find crypto ATMs and other services where you can buy and sell cryptocurrencies for cash. On their website, you can search by coin, address, if the ATM supports selling as well as buying, and you can also search by geo area, country, state, city. You can also check and compare actual current fees at different ATMs. If you want to find out more, head over to coinatmradar.com, which is coinatmradar.com. So, hey everyone, I have the fantastic pleasure of speaking with the one and only Peter Rizun, Chief Scientist at Bitcoin Unlimited. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty fantastic. It's exciting times to be in crypto, and I know that as a kind of bit of intro to the whole subject, obviously we've both been in crypto for a long time. I first started posting about Bitcoin like around 12 or so years ago. I was an active daily user of Bitcoin during the block size wars, and then transitioned on other things afterwards. But so I remember the scaling debate from like ground zero, from like when Mike Hearn first put out his famous article. That's all the way on, and it seems like kind of like the block size war, the scaling debate, sort of got settled in the crypto public mind in favor of the small block camp, just because the big BTC, that version of Bitcoin, ended up winning out the market share and the mind share, and then Ethereum started to pivot towards kind of a L2 scaling roadmap as well over the years. And it's only been in the last couple of years we've had sort of a resurgence in on-chain scaling technology, and or I should say hitting the forefront of the world, but it's mostly been in chains like, let's say, for example, Solana or Multiverse X or some of these other more modern kind of account-based model things. And so seeing the UTXO model, the kind of the old school blockchain type thing coming back with new stuff is very interesting. So that's just a kind of big preference to this whole thing.
Yeah, it's funny what you said about Bitcoin settling on the small block roadmap and Ethereum pivoting to L2. It's like if you look at the architecture of the two coins, Bitcoin's UTXO model is ideal for scaling. Mm-hmm. Yet the community is doing everything it can to prevent it from scaling. Whereas Ethereum's account-based Turing complete model is very difficult to scaling because it's very difficult to parallelize. Yet they're trying as hard as they can to scale. So it's kind of ironic how that worked out.
Yeah, of course. And it is kind of ironic how like the UTXO model is something that ended up being kind of like everything in crypto in the very beginning, and it's distinctly in the minority now, and you only have some newer chains like Cardano, for example, that are still even mentioning that kind of stuff. And so yeah, it is kind of interesting to see how that whole space shook out.
So do you have a theory on why that might be? Why more modern coins are using the account-based model?
If I could have a theory on that, I would probably say it's because Ethereum was the kind of the pioneer, or the first goer, the first big mover on a lot of these certain kinds of functionalities that needed Turing completeness, global state, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And it just because everyone was trying to do exactly those things in different, more scalable ways, rather than that's if I were to guess.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. I would say it even more harshly. I think everybody just copied Ethereum. Ethereum was
Mm-hmm.
the first to do the Turing complete thing. People wanted to remain Turing complete, so they copied Ethereum's account-based model. But that they weren't making a decision based on scalability. They were making a decision based on, well, what can we done? What can we do fastest?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And I think anyone who looked at this critically, I think, could see that the account-based ideology, the account-based architecture, is bound to have problems. So it's nice to see us coming back to the UTXO model because, really, in my opinion, that's the only model that can scale to global levels.
Yeah. It's so. Why don't we just start there? That's a great starting point. Is the difference between a UTXO and account model just on the base? So, from my from my newbie understanding from back in the day, the big differentiator was account based had one address, and UTXO you could have a bunch of addresses, kind of thing, which is obviously frustrating for any technical person to be like, no, that's not it, that's not everything. But so you keep hearing things about, like, for example, the account model being necessary for global state for smart contracts and the UTXO model being more fragmented or whatever. So would you mind just in a simple way kind of just breaking down what are the major differences between the two models?
Your description of the account-based model, I think, was accurate. So if I have an account on Ethereum, I have my account address, and people can send me money, and it credits my account, and I can send people money, and it debits my account. So there's one account that can grow in size or be reduced in size. So I could have more than one account, but I mean fundamentally you can think of it as each person has a single account that, like a bank account. The UTXO model, I would say your description was not right. So
Mm-hmm.
you said you could have more than one address, but Bitcoin doesn't work like that. The
Mm-hmm.
UTXO model fundamentally doesn't really even have addresses in a sense. They're individual coins.
Yeah.
So so I can create a public key, and from that, I can derive an address. But if you send me money to that address, what you're doing is you're destroying some of your coins, and you're creating, let's say, two new coins, and one new coin is getting deposited to my address.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, and the other coin is being sent back to your wallet.
Yes.
So
So it's coins instead of balances. So instead of a bank
right,
account
so
balance, it's like coins in your pocket, like cash, different paper bills, things like that.
right, so let's say you sent me one Bitcoin. It's sitting in this address I have, but now you send me another Bitcoin. So now that address has a balance of two, but it's not really a balance of two. It's actually two individual one BTC coins. And if I go to spend from that address, let's say, I have to take one of those coins, and let's say I'm going to send half of it to my friend Bob, and then half of it back into my own address. So transactions with Bitcoin are fundamentally at the coin level. There's coins, and you have to spend a coin completely. And because you might not want to send all that coin to the recipient, you split that coin into two coins. Part of it goes to the recipient, and part of it will go back to you. It could go back to your same address, or it could go back to a completely new address. But at a fundamental level, all that exists in the Bitcoin UTXO model are individual coins, whereas in Ethereum, it's accounts that can grow and be reduced.
Yeah. So that makes sense. And for people who, like, I've been using crypto for a very long time, and so I'm very used to having, change addresses, and in certain cases disabling extra change addresses just to keep everything coming back to the same, like, one address if I want to, for transparency reasons, for example, combining inputs, all that stuff. Very kind of familiar from a digital cash is kind of like real cash in some ways. So for the end user, of course, that just makes it a little bit more confusing because just a balance is what we're used to. But how, first off, do you know where the UTXO model came from? Like, why was that what was chosen for Bitcoin out of everything, out of all the potential models?
I think Satoshi was a very smart person. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, people sometimes point out mistakes they believe Satoshi made, but Satoshi was brilliant, and I think he thought about this very clearly, and it was obvious to him that the only way to have a system that scales, the system that's parallelizable, is using the UTXO model. An
Interesting.
account model, it's very difficult to parallelize an account-based model.
Yeah, for sure. So when we talk about scaling and things like that, it's also just a very sort of nebulous concept to the layman, let's just say, as far as like can do more transactions. What are the key scaling bottlenecks when you want to kind of scale past like a million transactions a day or so? Because you hear this repeated a lot in the meta of blockchains can't scale or they're terribly designed for scaling and stuff. And that doesn't seem like something that I would necessarily agree with. But so what stops them from scaling? Where's the big bottlenecks you have to worry about?
Okay, so I think we got to divide this conversation into UTXO models and account models. So let's
Yes.
talk about UTXO models first. And there's very little bottlenecks to scaling UTXO model coins. The bottlenecks that exist right now are primarily due to poor software design. Like Bitcoin Core is a very poorly designed piece of software. It doesn't take advantage of all the parallelization opportunities that the UTXO model presents. So let's talk about let's talk about how so your readers, your listeners probably all know that the network, the Bitcoin network, consists of a bunch of nodes all over the world. So what does a node do when it receives a Bitcoin transaction? So the transaction comes into the node. The node is going to say, okay, this transaction is trying to spend this one particular coin. So it's going to go and look up in its UTXO database, the database that has all the unspent available coins, and it's going to check, does that coin exist? And if it does, then okay, that kind of ticks that box. And now it's going to see, well, did the person who made this transition, did they sign this transaction with a valid signature? So now we do some other math to check the digital signature. Okay, and let's assume that's all good. And if that's all good, then that transaction will also specify what new coins we're going to create. So I'm going to spend this one coin, and I'm going to create two new coins, one to you, Joel, and one back to my own wallet. So if the signature, if the initial input coin existed, and the signature was valid, then my node is going to remove the input coin from the UTXO database and replace it with these two new coins, one that goes to you and one that goes back to my wallet. So what are the bottlenecks here? So one of them is checking the signatures. So checking the signatures is a very computationally complex problem. It takes around 300,000 clock cycles on a CPU to do the math required to determine whether this signature is actually a valid signature. So if you work that out, a single core in your computer, it can maybe do 5,000 digital signature verifications per second. So that's a limitation right there. Is everything I'm saying making sense so far?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, but what's nice about Bitcoin's design is it's parallelizable. So all Bitcoin transactions can be validated in parallel. We can check all. Let's say my node gets 100 different transactions. I can check all of those digital signatures with different CPU cores. If I had 100 CPU cores available, I could check 100 digital signatures at the same time. So that's why I say the UTXO model is highly scalable, because it's highly parallelizable like that.
Yeah, so from like a hardware perspective, if you have a lot of most modern computers do have multiple cores, and then if you just wanted to run, have like a node checking all these, then it kind of takes advantage of that. And so that's because you're checking the signatures of the transactions. Now, how does it work with the account-based model then? It's got to work somewhere different?
Well, but before let's just because there's one more thing I want to talk about the UTXO model
Sure.
first, and that's actually checking whether the coins are spent. Okay, so so all these transactions are coming in now. We're imagining 100 coins coming in parallel. But let's say two of those 100 transactions, they're trying to spend the same coin. So when my node checks the database to see if the coin is actually unspent, and I have another process that also checks at the same time. Those two processes can't spend the same coin at the same time. So this is one of the scaling limitations. You you so the signature checking can all be highly parallelized, but there are a couple serial steps that have to take place in the UTXO database to ensure that the same coin is not spent twice by two different parallel threads on the node. So that means there has to be a certain order with which the UTXO database is being accessed, and that limits how fast the UTXO database can run. So I think that limitation is very high. I think it's like in the round of like 1 billion transactions per second. We have hardware that that can update the UTXO set at several millions of transactions per second before we run into that limit. But there is a fundamental limit, but it's very high, and I can't see us hitting that even in the wildest success cases of Bitcoin.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that does make sense. It's so the account model doesn't have the same signature checking for unspent transaction outputs. So how does the scaling bottleneck work with the account model?
Yeah. So let's say I write you a transaction in Ethereum for $9. So I'm going to send you $9 from my account, and my account has $10 in it. All right. But I'm also going to send $9 to my wife, and I'm going to broadcast those transactions at the same time. So how do you, which transaction is valid? How does your node deal with that? Yeah. Okay. So if in the UTX, okay, go ahead.
So in the UTXO model, you already have checked where the coins were spent to via the signatures, right?
Yes. So in the UTXO model, I would either have to do a double spend, like send the same coin twice, and my UTXO database is going to check that, or I send two different coins. But if I only have $10, the one won't be big enough, so I can't actually make the transaction. Whereas Ethereum, I could say, okay, I'm going to write a transaction that debits my account by $9 and credits your account by $9, and write another transaction that debits my account by $9 and credits my wife up by $9. But now those transactions come in, but there's no way you can process those in parallel. You have to process those sequentially because one of them has to happen first. And is that making any sense?
Yes. So you have to go the first one because then you have to update your both balances, and then you go to the next one, and when it tries to update, you're like, wait, the balance is already updated. Now that's not valid anymore.
Right. And then so because Ethereum is Turing complete, and there's the contracts have access to the global state. There could be another smart contract running that you guys don't even know about, you or my wife don't know about, and then suddenly it's going to debit my account by $5 or something, and both those payments will fail, and we can't really tell ahead of time whether that's going to happen. So at the fundamental level, the Ethereum machine is a sequential machine. It has to make its manipulations to the global state in a sequential way, whereas in the UTXO model, because all a transaction can do to the global state in the UTXO model is destroy coins in full. So the region of state space that a Bitcoin transaction can alter is firewalled. We know it ahead of time. In Ethereum, we don't know it ahead of time. So that's what makes it fundamentally sequential in nature.
Yeah, for sure. It's so when just talking about that from that perspective, it just seems like the original crypto model, which would be UTXO, seems like it would be like the no-brainer to stick with. So what are some of the benefits that people were seeking when they're switching to an account-based model, which inherently kind of has a scaling bottleneck that the UTXO model doesn't have? So what's the benefit of having a global state?
I think it was easier to create useful smart contracts. So in what can a Bitcoin transaction can do? A Bitcoin transaction, the inputs to a Bitcoin transaction are fixed. So any Bitcoin transaction has to say, I'm spending coin A, coin B, coin C. That can't change. So I could have this crazy script which allows those coins to be spent and sends them to somewhere else, depending on what conditions happen. But there's no way I can change the fact that those 3 coins are the ones being spent. Whereas Ethereum, the contracts can be written in very flexible ways. So a contract has access to the entire global state. So based on how it evolves, it could spend from one account, it could spend from a different account, it could credit one account, could credit a different account. It's very flexible in what it can do in that way. Like a good example is a flash loan. Like flash loans are something popular in Ethereum, but it would be very hard to create a flash loan in a UTXO model with a single transaction at least.
Yeah. So does that mean that things like, for example, flash loans are just not possible in the UTXO model, or are they just much trickier to architect?
This is probably a question for like Andrew Stone, the developer that I work with on Nexa. I'm more scaling boy, theory boy about computation, but the actual mechanics of the smart contract I'm not too familiar with. But I think the way it's going to turn out is we'll be able to show that any contract you can create in an account-based model can be created in a UTXO model, assuming it has a Turing-complete scripting system, but it might take more than one transaction to do that. So I think we can create with the same function, but it'll look different. Rather than a single transaction smart contract, it'll have to be executed over a few different transactions.
Yeah, and so obviously stop me if it starts to become more too into the smart contract territory then. But is there an inherent problem with doing it in multiple transactions as opposed to one? Or, and also if you have to do multiple transactions as opposed to one, does that then kind of come back around to a scalability problem, or the same scalability level, because you have to do multiple, even though it's easier to scale the multiples, you do have to do multiples to kind of accomplish the same goal?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think I would say we don't know. So in the case where you need to, create multiple transactions, and especially if the second transaction depends on what happens in the first transaction, that means you need some other agent, either the creator of the smart contract has to be sitting on his computer, like creating the second and third and fourth transaction, and obviously that's less useful than an Ethereum contract that runs autonomously, or the programmer has to create some piece of software that's running somewhere else that's issuing these second, third, and fourth transactions to execute the smart contract. I think, though, when we look into this more deeply, we'll be able to create transactions in the UTXO model that automatically spawn new transactions themselves. And that, I think, will be like the holy grail, because now you have the full benefits of these single contracts from Ethereum. So they're executed the UTXO model over multiple transactions, but they spawn themselves automatically. So there's no extra agent. There's no developer who created having to create the second and third transactions, or there's no other server somewhere else creating those second and third transactions. Those transactions are being created as part of executing the first transaction. The first transaction executes, it spawns a second transaction, a third transaction, and that'll happen autonomously through the Bitcoin or the UTXO coin network itself. So I mean that's speculative. I don't think anyone has proven that, but that's what I think we will be able to show. So that, I think that's really cool. So I think that would be amazing if that happens. And your other question was about scalability. Does that affect scalability? But no, it doesn't affect scalability, because the only way you're going to hurt scalability is if you start broadening the region of state space that transactions have access to. As long as the rule is followed that a transaction can only spend these fixed inputs and has to spend them in full or not at all, then there's no scaling problem, because it remains fully parallelizable. So a lot of people think that the scaling problem comes from the fact that, like, these smart contracts, they have a lot of computations. Oh, the halting problem. A smart contract might take many clock cycles to run. That's not the problem. The problem is the lack of parallelizability.
Yeah. So basically, because of the challenge of having to architect a contract in such a way where you don't have to keep on executing multiple transactions manually on sequentially, because it's just easier to say, yeah, just do it all at once. They kind of placed a very significant bottleneck on the transaction throughput as a whole, because you can't parallelize it. So just by cutting off the ability to parallelize it, everything got easier to create and kind of easier to get going on these smart contracts, and easier to make them, I guess, run smoothly, but at the cost of it just so much harder to get so many more through the system.
Yeah, and they're trying hard. Like they have a lot of really smart people in Ethereum trying to scale level one, and I think they've given up, and it's because of the lack of parallelizability. And to me, like if you look at the conversations back when Ethereum was coming out, there were many people saying this was a fundamental problem. They're like, Ethereum is never going to scale because it can't be parallelized.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to talk to Vitalik. Honestly, like you must have known this or thought about this when you created it. Like what was the long-term plan there? So I don't know. Maybe they just hope they come up with a solution, 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road, and they thought it was worthwhile just because they could do some pretty interesting, useful things with these powerful smart contracts. And there's truth in that. I mean, I think, before Ethereum, a lot of people thought, well, Bitcoin is great. We don't need more powerful scripting. Smart contracts are not useful. But I think Ethereum has demonstrated that no, smart contracts are very useful, and this idea of a global computer is an enticing idea that can lead to all sorts of opportunities. So I would love to see sophisticated Turing-complete smart contracts on a UTXO model, and I think Ethereum helped pave the way to that. So even if Ethereum dies because of its lack of scalability, I think it still did it still provided an important service to the crypto community by demonstrating how useful the idea of a global computer is to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So now for the raw scalability thing, without even going into the complexities of using programmatic type things. So in the, obviously in the early days, the block size debate was around, can you actually scale to large volumes for just basic transactions? And then we have seen a few big block versions of Bitcoin and other similar cryptocurrencies manage to do a lot higher volumes, but still, other than like Bitcoin SV, we haven't really seen, and of course I've seen plenty of our of Twitter banter or X banter, whatever, back and forth with that team. We haven't really, we saw kind of a certain, I guess I would say pretty good level of scalability at a certain point, but then things do start to sort of break down. What really kind of the nut of this whole conversation, of course, is I saw some posts of yours on scaling using customized node hardware, using hardware to help make mass scalability work. Do you mind? So usually, traditionally, everything that I've heard about scaling up until now, or now, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of the focus has been on software, on bandwidth, on things like that, trying to get things optimized and optimized throughput, etc. But hardware, usually when we think about hardware for crypto, customized hardware, we've thought of ASICs and other mining machines to run the proof of work algorithm much more efficiently, etc. But for actual node hardware, would you mind kind of going into that concept a little bit?
Sure. But let's rewind it first and talk about what do we mean when we say scalability? When someone says this architecture or this node is scalable, what does that mean to you, Joel?
It just means that it can process a large amount of throughput. That's kind of the base of it. And of course, there's other things that go into as far as how efficiently and with which trade-offs and things like that. And that's kind of secondary. That's kind of next follow-up questions. But the first question is, can it process this high volume of traffic?
Right. And I think that's what most people think about when they hear the word scalable. But to me, that's not what it means. To me, what scalable means is if you double the hardware, do you double the throughput? So by increasing the hardware, do you get a proportionate increase in like the number of transactions per second or whatever other performance metric you're curious about? So when we say scalable, that's what we mean at Nexa Bitcoin Unlimited. So have you seen the work by Eric Foskill on Bitcoin?
Uh, I haven't gotten deep into it, but I've seen a lot of mention of it and seen some high level summary posts.
Yeah, so he's done a fantastic job re-implementing the Bitcoin core node. So he calls it LibBitcoin, and it's a ground-up re-implementation of the Satoshi Bitcoin software, and it runs on the BTC network, and I think it also runs on the LTC network. But he's written the code in a way that properly takes advantage of all these parallelization opportunities I talked about with the UTXO model. So what that means is if you have a 4-core computer and you run LibBitcoin will distribute the transaction verification across your 4 cores. If you have a 16-core machine, it will distribute it over the 16 cores. If you have a 128-core machine, it'll distribute the work over 128 cores. So you'll get 128 times the throughput with a 128-core machine as you would with a 1-core machine. So that's what I call scalable software. So
And so just to pause for a second, if you did run just the core implementation, Bitcoin Core, with a 128 core machine, how many of those cores would be taken advantage of in that?
Well, I haven't checked since when we did the 1 gigabyte block. We did some tests on 1 gigabyte blocks. So we gave a talk at Stanford at the Scaling Bitcoin conference, and the answer is 1. It would take advantage of 1 core, and then it would start to die.
Yeah, that does seem to be a problem. Yeah, so sorry, pause, resume.
Yeah, no, but it's a really good point. So that's why I said Bitcoin Core is so poorly designed, because it doesn't have the scalability property. If you put Bitcoin Core on a 10 times more powerful machine, you hardly get any more performance at all out of it, because it's not designed in a way that can take advantage of all that extra hardware. And this has nothing to do with the Bitcoin Satoshi white paper model version of Bitcoin itself. It's purely to do with poor software engineering in the first place.
Interesting. And maybe a little bit of a side note, but do you think that poor engineering it's just poor engineering, or do you think it's poor engineering because the goals were not, the goals of the project were not to have good engineering necessary, did not necessitate good engineering, meaning because you don't have a massive amount of transactions coming through the network on the BTC network, there just isn't that drive there isn't as much of a drive to try to make things efficient or parallelize, for example.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think Satoshi was a big blocker. He wanted massive numbers of transactions per second. But I think he wrote his software the way he did just because he wanted to get it out. He didn't want to spend 5 years creating the perfect parallelized version of the software. He figured people would improve it as the need arose. But I think when BTC was captured and the whole small block store of value, we don't want to actually spend our Bitcoin narrative became dominant, then nobody really cares about making Bitcoin Core more efficient. They don't care about it making it scalable to take advantage of the hardware, because there's no point. If you're a small blocker, in a way, it's kind of bad if your software can scale, because then people can argue that you can support bigger blocks.
Which does kind of make it interesting that LibBitcoin then does have these efficiency improvements for the inefficient version of Bitcoin.
Right.
Kind of a happy accident.
Yeah, well, I think that the happy accident is because whether you're a big blocker or a small blocker, you still care whether you can download the entire blockchain to Genesis and verify all the transactions. So right now that takes a very long time in Core. I think it takes like 24 hours or something in Bitcoin Core, even on a powerful machine.
A few days,
but
a couple of years ago,
sorry,
I synced I was running a Lightning node just because, I hate myself apparently, but as part of that, I had to sync Bitcoin Core since the beginning, and that was on an SSD, not a relatively modern computer back a couple of years ago. It was over a day. It was like multiple days, I think.
It takes a long time. But now LibBitcoin, thanks to Eric's work, can, with a sufficiently powerful machine, it can sync the entire blockchain from Genesis in under an hour, because it can distribute that work to all of the different cores on that big powerful machine.
Yeah, and so which other implementations of Bitcoin, and I shouldn't, and now I'm opening up past Bitcoin Core, like to, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, whatever. Which other implementations take advantage, or are there any that take advantage of that multiple core parallelization for downloading the chain in the same way as the Bitcoin does?
So the Bitcoin Unlimited, which is now Nexa,
Mm-hmm.
does we do a pretty good job, but and Bitcoin Cash does a pretty good job. That we both implementations have got rid of a lot of bottlenecks to allow for more parallelization. But nobody is doing as good of a job as the Bitcoin is right now. So we hope to get there with Nexa, and that's what the hardware I'm working on is going to do. And I think will be much better than the Bitcoin when this hardware is fully finished. But at the moment, Bitcoin I think is the best implementation in terms of it has the scalability property. It takes advantage of whatever hardware you throw at it. I don't think any other implementation does that right now.
Yeah, I mean that does seem like it improves quite a few things. So now the concept of hardware, right?
Yeah.
So we already talked about sort of, or custom hardware, I should say, because we already talked about not custom hardware, but basically taking full advantage of more advanced hardware in order to scale. But now you mentioned customized hardware.
Yeah.
Yes.
So right. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got across the idea that scalability means the ability for your software or your implementation to take advantage of more hardware. So
Mm-hmm.
let's look at Libitcoin syncing from Genesis, because I think that's a really useful example. So Eric did a test where he had it was like a small 4-core machine or 8-core machine. He bought it from Temu for like $350, and he was able to sync the blockchain and all the transactions in like 46 minutes or something, and that's crazy. But what he didn't do was he didn't check the signatures.
Mm.
When he checked the signatures, did that push the time out to like 10 hours or something? Because signature checks are very computationally expensive, like I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So me and Eric did the math, and it was something like he would have to have a 64-core machine in order to do the signatures quickly enough to keep up with what his 4 cores could do to downloading. So that's showing that signature checking is hugely difficult. Is the bottleneck compared to everything else. So he can still do it in an hour. It just would take a 64-core machine, and that's like an $8,000 machine or something.
Yeah.
So what we can do with custom hardware. So now think, but all those 64 cores, all they're doing is doing the same math over and over and over again. Like a modern core has hundreds of millions of transistors in it, and you have those hundreds of millions of transistors. Most of them are just sitting idle, and there's just a small little path in those 64 cores that are running the digital signature verification algorithm. So what we said, well, that's a waste. With 300 million transistors, the number of transistors in a single core, we can make 64 small little cores, and all those cores do is digital signature verification. So that's what we've been doing, and we have this working on a field programmable gate array, and we're developing an ASIC. But this will allow us to, for like Eric's 4-core machine, you plug in this custom piece of hardware, and that custom piece of hardware has 64 little micro cores, but those micro cores only do digital signature verification. And now this is blazing fast. So now his $350 machine can keep up with what the $8,000 machine can do. And how much does this little card, this little specialized hardware card, hardly cost anything. So. Like if you look at how small the microchip would be to fit 64 digital signature verifier cores, it's like 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters of silicon. You could profitably make that and sell that chip for under $10, and now you're talking like 1 million transactions per second.
Yeah, and so when people think about ASICs and miners and stuff, what people are usually today, what they're thinking of is professionalized mining farms, and more importantly, large, like an entire machine that's just dedicated towards this, and in fact, whole server rooms full of these machines. Now, what you're describing so far seems to be maybe it could end up in that direction. But right now, it would just be some extra little piece of hardware that you could plug into your existing computer that then just runs it and makes it more efficient. Is that semi-accurate?
It's semi-accurate. Well, there's two paths that we're pursuing. There is the path that you're talking about, where you plug in this little card, and the computer can offload computationally expensive tasks to it. So the obvious one is digital signature verification. Later, the other one will be UTXO database management. So you can imagine another card that looks like a non-volatile memory hard drive, but instead it's like a specialized UTXO database. You plug that card in, and then you have a blazing fast UTXO database that your node can take advantage of. So that's approach number one. So that's basically you have the regular node software, and you're slowly offloading the bottlenecks to specialized hardware. The other path that we're pursuing is creating an entire hardware node. So so you could create like a little box that would look like a Mac Mini, or even smaller. It could be like a couple inches square, and that's your entire Bitcoin node, and it's all running on specialized hardware. It plugs in near your router, and then your regular computer can talk to that node. So your regular computer would have your wallet on it, and you would just talk to your node over your local network.
Yeah, it's so. I guess what makes this different from mining is with mining, there's always a constant arms race to get more and more and more performance, because you then get more money if you do that. Whereas with a node, you don't need to constantly be making it more and more performant. You can make it performant enough to work, and then that's fine. You don't actually gain from having a beefier and beefier and beefier node necessarily, unless the network needs that for you to process things.
Exactly. So I imagine like the chip we're building should easily do 1 million verifications per second. And it will be, like I said, the die, the piece of silicon inside will be 3 millimeters by 3 millimeters. So this is tiny. But that one little chip is probably enough to, for our whole lifetimes. Like, unless you imagine like a future where we're getting more than 100,000 transactions per second on the network, that little tiny $10 chip is all you'd ever need. And if you need more, you just throw more chips on your circuit board because of that parallelizability property.
Yeah, it's so. What are some of the potential drawbacks of using a customized hardware approach? Like maybe off the top of my head, I might think like manufacturing bottlenecks, or maybe so. For example, in the ASIC world of like Bitcoin mining, you have a few companies like Bitmain, for example, that kind of control the production of almost everything, and then you could potentially say that that's like a centralizing or censorship vector. Do you think that could be the same thing with like a customized hardware such as this for nodes?
No, I don't see that as a problem at all. I think I don't think there's any downside to the Bitcoin community or to the Bitcoin ecosystem with specialized hardware. I see it as only upside.
Yeah, interesting.
Because there's no barrier to entry. So because so maybe Bitmain has the best technology for mining, and so they can kind of create a bottleneck there. But that's because of the arms race you were talking about. So for a node just has to be fast enough to keep up, and you don't need the latest greatest ASIC to keep up. So it'll be it won't be easy, but it will be feasible to have several different vendors with customized node hardware that works just fine.
Yeah, for sure. And as far as that's concerned, a small side note that I thought that it's one of these questions where I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, but for the viewers at home, might as well ask it. Is assuming a UTXO model, which is of course what we're talking about, is this impacted by using proof of stake or proof of work? Either one for your actual like anti-Sybil mechanism. As in, if you had a proof of stake UTXO chain, which there's not many of those, would all this still be kind of applicable?
I think so, because I don't see why. I mean, I'm no fan of proof of stake. I think proof of stake is a broken idea for other reasons. But if you just in terms of scalability, I don't think it would matter.
Yeah. So that is kind of interesting. It would be pretty interesting to see, just from pure scalability standpoint, how that would shake out because obviously with proof of work, it has become very like industrialized with larger and larger mining farms and things like that. And yeah, it would be interesting to see that with the anti-Sybil mechanism being not physical, and then you could just run your validators on very small, cheap pieces of hardware, which would kind of be an interesting thought experiment to do. So how I guess far out there has this idea gotten? As in, how much traction has it gotten? Is it have you received a lot of feedback on this? Are there other people who are approaching it from a similar perspective? Have you heard any major criticisms that of this whole approach that yeah.
No, I think most people, once they understand it, they seem to think that it's the inevitable path for Bitcoin or for like UTXO cryptocurrencies, including Nexa, Bitcoin Cash. I think the hard thing is just getting other people to understand it. People think, I don't think people can, a lot of people have a hard time understanding how what we're using as software right now can be done in a little tiny chip. That just blows their mind. So I think getting them to realize that it can, and that it makes a lot of sense, will go a long way. Like you see, it's similar to like everybody takes graphics cards for granted right now. Like the CPU is not doing all the graphics processing; the graphics card is. It would be crazy to try to do that on your CPU because you're wasting so much CPU resources. Everyone thinks that's obvious now, but I mean it's the same logic for specialized Bitcoin hardware. Like we're going to look back at this and say, wasn't it crazy that we were doing like trying to do like 1 million verifications per second on CPUs? Like why didn't we just create these little tiny circuits? And that's all they were good for, and it could do it at like 1/100th of the energy and for like 1/1000th of the price. It's going to seem that obvious once this is done, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, like from my understanding and from what I've heard so far, it does seem like at the whole, because of advances such as these, the UTXO model is significantly more efficient to do. We talked earlier about the trade-offs between the account model and the UTXO for like the global state purposes, as far as it's easier to do smart contracts if you have a global state and things like that. Now, all that being said, so the account-based world, the smart contract world, which have a massive overlap right there, are approaching massive on-chain scaling in some different ways where, for example, I don't know how much you are into or how much you well read into sharding you are. I kind of understand very conceptually how you shard an account-based chain. And do you know very much about that?
Not really. I mean, I've read a little bit, but I don't understand the difference. When does two chains like connected by some kind of bridge become one chain that's sharded? Like it seems to me there's always going to be some trade-off like crossing the shard. But
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like what?
From my understanding, it's mostly like latency because of when you combine the shards together. But I guess that should be that's the next step in research from my perspective is kind of go into that kind of thing. But it does seem like some of these chains, like Solana has its own. I heard the term parallelized used a whole lot, but I'm sure it works in a very different way. So it is kind of interesting that now we're at a stage where there's this problem is being approached from quite a bunch of different ways, but the sort of consensus in this area is that you can scale a blockchain to mass market levels to reach the world without using second and third layers or off-chain type things, and you can do it with sufficient decentralization. Now, still, it's kind of interesting to see that where most of the innovation's happening is in that department, but still most of the capitalization and the surface level mind share is in the concept of you cannot scale a blockchain at all. It just it's inherently not scalable with the kind of small block thing. Do you see that that old school mindset being, do you think it's going to go away anytime soon? I mean, that maybe that's not exactly a technical question, but just more of a social ecosystem question. What are you hearing about? Are you hearing the space starting to like come back to, I guess, big blockerism, as it were, or how are you seeing it?
Yeah, well, there's that saying that society goes mad all at once, and but
Mm-hmm.
men become sane one by one. So I think that's what's happening. I think
Mm-hmm.
somehow this narrative, the blockchains can't stale, became dominant, and all these, even these really smart people that should know better, started to buy into it. Like it was weird because I would talk to professors of computer science, professors of electrical engineering, and they would take it as axiomatic that a blockchain can't scale. I would say, well, why? Like I would
Mm-hmm.
talk about UTXOs, and they would. It's like the brain couldn't actually like think independently. It's just they were just on narrative parrot mode. Like, and I think we
Mm-hmm.
you know we I think we saw a lot of this narrative parrot mode with COVID as well. But it seems like that people can get infected with these memes, these viral brain memes, and
Mm-hmm.
then they just shut their brain up to new information. So blockchains can't scale is one of them. Like anyone who's actually read the Satoshi white paper, understands how it works, understands electronics and computers, can see that it scales really well. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost perfectly parallelizable. Like obviously it scales really well, but but people just couldn't see that for some reason because they had blinders on. It was such a weird thing for me to experience that. So it's great that people are starting to talk about scalability in the sense of UTXO coins now, and I think slowly people are coming to realize that we can scale pretty good.
Yeah, and so I guess this is a strange question, maybe, but that no, we definitely don't know the answer to, but we could speculate. Is as this tide starts to turn, obviously, scaling a blockchain makes making more efficient tech wins out in a vacuum, and just over time, the more efficient tech will. Maybe not each piece of more efficient tech, but on the whole, more efficient tech will start to win out over and over and over again. As far as Bitcoin and Ethereum, but let's just say specifically Bitcoin, BTC in this case,
Mm-hmm.
do you see a future where BTC starts to implement all this kind of stuff and starts to go back to a scaling, like a mass scaling approach? Or do you think Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum are kind of going to be stuck in their ways, and it's rather that they will be supplanted by other competitors rather than end up switching to avoid being supplanted? What would your guess be if you were just to predict things? Put your little wizard hat on for a second.
It's a really hard question to answer because before I used to be a Bitcoin maxi before the
Mm-hmm.
blockchain wars. I was like, it's stupid to work on any other altcoin because any sufficiently useful technology can be absorbed by BTC.
Mm-hmm.
But for some reason that didn't happen. Like we've seen Ethereum demonstrate that smart contracts are useful, but very little work has gone into improving Bitcoin BTC's scripting language.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen people love stablecoins, but most of the stablecoin activity is on Tron. Like,
Yeah.
why is it not on BTC? It's crazy, and the reason it's not is because BTC fees are too damn high.
Yeah,
So
and Ethereum as
so
well.
yeah, but Ethereum can't really solve the problem. They would if they could solve the problem, they would. BTC can solve the problem. It's just they don't want to. So they could have better smart contracts and they could have lower fees, that they just don't want to do it. So yeah. Let's say we demonstrate that we can do these. We can make a $20 node 10 years down the road. We have these $20 hardware nodes. They can do 10 million transactions per second. They're super reliable, super cheap. There's a formal specification. We can formally show that these electronic circuits are validating the consensus rules perfectly. Would BTC start adopting that? I don't know. It seems like, well, why wouldn't they? But then why don't they just increase the block size at least a little bit to get the fees down? Why don't they add more scripting opcodes to allow more sophisticated smart contracts? So it's a hard question to answer. So
Yeah.
I don't know. So I think what would happen is you'll have other competing chains like BCH or Nexa that will just be demonstrating what we can do. You'll see market share move to those coins, and then at a certain point, either BTC like adopts the technology, in which case I think it would win, but maybe it can't. Maybe there's just so much that core that maxi attitude that BTC is already perfect will just prevent it from actually changing itself in time to prevent a takeover from another coin.
Yeah, that is interesting. An interesting perspective, and I think we're at a kind of adoption phase where Bitcoin is becoming become adopted by institutions and companies as reserve assets, and now governments are talking about it. And there's still like for that idea is out there, and it just takes years for that to still be implemented across the world, in which case that's still like room to grow, which means room to not be punished for your mistakes, sort of. So it's still a few more years. So if this does end up changing, I would probably personally predict it would be, at least another few years before we start to see the ceiling, the growth ceiling start to get hit, and then the hard questions start to be asked. One side thought. So, guys, sorry, go ahead on that first.
Well, I was going to ask your opinion. Like, let's assume that it becomes really obvious that we can do like 1 million transactions per second with really low cost hardware, that scalability is really not a problem for the UTXO Satoshi Bitcoin model. Do you think BTC could soft or hard fork to allow that to happen, or do you think it would just become a political nightmare that ends up going nowhere?
My opinion on that, if I were to guess, is there's a lot of people who are invested in Bitcoin continuing the trajectory on a technological scale, at least, that it has. And those people are not going to give up without a fight. So that being said, I think the only time you'd see any kind of significant changes would be in some sort of an existential kind of a way. So not necessarily for massive upside, but to avoid massive downside. Two things I can imagine that would cause that would be a security budget crisis, where you have the continuing halving of the block rewards over time and not enough fee revenue coming to support that. And so maybe a hard fork to try to create a tail emission, although that does create all the kinds of other, problems with the 21 million sacred limit and things like that. Or, for example, something involving like a quantum computing threat, where now it's like, okay, we have to make some changes in order to keep the chain secure. And at that time, once you make the change, it's just like when you have a wiggly tooth. Like once it's already wiggly, it's easier to move it any direction you want to go. And so I think that right now, before there's an existential reason to change something, the odds of changes are very low. But if there is an existential reason to change something, that might be a good opportunity to slip in some other changes and then see how that goes.
Okay, and so the case where you have this new UTXO coin that has much better scalability, it's fully parallelizable, there's a hardware node implementation, it's cheap, it does millions of transactions per second, it has a Turing-complete scripting language, it's kind of like the ideal version of Bitcoin, and this coin is getting market share, and suddenly it's at like 1/4 of BTC's market cap. Is that existential in your opinion, or do you think they would still stick with the small block narrative?
I think 1/4 is nowhere near existential. It would have to be like 3/4 or something. And also, the economy is a weird thing. And Bitcoin has become much less useful from its traditional standpoint with each passing year. But it's arguable that it's become more useful to certain people in certain use cases, as far as like institutions, for example. So like the more transparency that you have over the entire chain, like the less privacy, for example, the easier it is to verify the supply, movements, everything, and sort of trust it as an institutional asset. And to a certain extent, the no hard forks rule makes it that, not to be, disrespectful, but a lot of like boomers running boomer software that can't figure out how to upgrade their software, they don't have to worry about losing access to their funds while they figure out an upgrade, because it's just like that. And so if those people who don't care about it doing anything other than storing it, being able to look at it, and then every once in a while moving large pieces of it somewhere, if those people, it might just be that all the people trying to use Bitcoin for transactional purposes or other things will over time just migrate to the new chain, whereas the people who are left there will be like, well, I don't care if this ends up doubling Bitcoin's market cap because I want a tool for what I want to use it for, which is this safe, digital gold kind of thing that you sort of transfer around between custodians. In which case, then maybe it won't ever change. But if something threatens that core use case, where, for example, the network security could collapse or the ECDSA could be compromised, then that's something where everyone would be on board with a change, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. So it sounds like what you're saying is if the BTC community would allow another coin to actually supersede a market cap, provided the BTC could still thrive in some way as a store of value.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Interesting. I think that could be the case. I think we might have a multi-chain future where there's not just one dominant crypto. There's 6 of them, for instance.
Yeah, and even if there's one dominant one and a few less dominant ones, maybe BTC could be one of those less dominant ones. One other side note, which it just came to me, so I'm not exactly all this kind of scaling and parallelizability and things like that. Do you have an idea how privacy affects those kinds of things? So, for example, you have, if you go way back, you get, of course, like confidential transactions, which does not publicly display amounts and addresses, even though the transaction graph is open. Then you have, for example, Monero-style ring signatures plus CT, and then you have zero-knowledge approaches like, ZK snarks and things like that. As I'm starting to understand how these things work more, I cannot yet wrap my mind around how that could affect scalability. As in, because of the less of this information is public to fewer actors in the network, do you think, and you could just say, I have no idea, I haven't thought about that yet because, to be fair, I didn't bring this up in advance, but do you know if that could affect the mass scalability if you had some kind of extra privacy improvements on the base chain?
Okay, well, let's go back to what I mean when I say scalability. So what I mean is by doubling the hardware, do we get a doubling of the capacity of your node? So in the terms of confidential transactions, I understand how those work at the technical level, and I would say that will scale fine. Like there's a bit more, the big O notation. Like, is it to scale it with n or with n squared or with n cubed? This scales. It still scales as n, but it scales as n times 1.4. Well, we still call that linear scaling. So confidential transactions, I think, from my understanding, and I understand them fairly well, they will scale just the same as our current Bitcoin transactions. I don't know enough about how the ring signatures work to answer that question. I suspect they scale fine too. It's just a much larger coefficient in front of the n in the big O notation. But I'm not. Don't quote me on that because I haven't studied ring signatures at all. But what I do want to say about confidentiality and privacy is, in my opinion, BCH already has a perfectly great scalability privacy solution called Cache Fusion. Are you familiar with Cache Fusion?
Yeah, it's a coin join implementation.
Yeah, it's a coin join implementation, and what's wrong with that? Like, if you what I really liked where BCH was going is Cache Fusion was standard on the Electron Cache implementation. I think some other wallets made it standard too. So your coins would always just be mixing in the background. You could turn that off if you didn't want it, but by default, like, everyone's kind of mixing their coins through coin join, and that seems great to me. I don't see I don't see why more coins aren't using that, and it's so simple to understand.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on coin fusion?
Yeah, well, this is where we start another 2-hour podcast at this point. So just keeping it brief. It's a very complicated subject, but privacy is it's becoming increasingly hard to keep things private in the context of, for example, not only wide blockchain analytics, but also AI being able to spot kind of things that stick out and irregular behaviors and things like that. And it is I think, that's obviously a good start. I'm just, as you mentioned, like, it doesn't. I would hope that kind of your initial assessment is right, where scalability is all the same. It's just that maybe there's more to scale, but it's not like it doesn't fundamentally alter the kind of calculus of how this works, and you can still kind of do it. So that's kind of what I would say. So Nexa, a lot of people aren't terribly familiar with Nexa, and it seems to be the project that you're primarily focused on right now. If correct me if I'm wrong, of course. Would you mind just giving a quick little breakdown of what Nexa is, and then kind of what are the next cool things, the Nexa cool things on the horizon that you're kind of working on?
Okay, can I give you a longer description?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the core team of Nexa is myself, Andrew Stone, Andreas Suisani, who's Sick Pig, Andrew Clifford, who goes by Solux on social media, and Peter Shipper. And we all met back in the block size war times. Mm-hmm. And we were big blockers, and we were pushing really hard to scale. And at the time, the big impediment to scaling, or at least the narrative, was that, well, we can't propagate blocks fast enough. Mm-hmm. So we're like, well, yes, we can. We just have to not propagate blocks in full. So Peter Shipper came up with this thing called extreme thin blocks, or XThin.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those.
We implemented that Bitcoin Unlimited. And in real testing on the network, we demonstrated, how quickly we were able to send blocks across the network using XThin, even through the Great Firewall of China. And that kind of put Bitcoin Unlimited on the map, and S5 people on the map. And just from that point forward, we've kind of become a team, and we've worked together quite well. So we migrated to Bitcoin Cash. We were working on Bitcoin Cash for a long time. But then there's so many bad things happen with Bitcoin Cash. Mm-hmm. First, it was the Craig Wright stuff that I think really kind of split the Bitcoin Cash community between Bitcoin Cash and SV. And then the stuff with
Amari
Dadalniks, Amari Sachet, with eCash wanting to have the dev tax. And it just didn't seem like the right environment for us anymore. And we had, so let me backtrack another year. So when we started Bitcoin Cash, the idea was maybe Bitcoin Cash can supersede BTC to become Bitcoin. So that's what we wanted. We wanted the market to choose BCH over BTC. So at the time, we're like, okay, let's do as few changes as possible. Like we want to compete with BTC on the grounds of one change, just bigger blocks.
Yeah, of course.
So we didn't want to do anything else. But I think after like a couple years, it was pretty obvious that BCH is Bitcoin Cash, BTC is Bitcoin, and BCH is never going to be Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. So at that point, it seemed like, well, since our market cap is like 0.5% of BTC, let's start being a bit more aggressive in the changes we make to kind of make a better Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. But then it was very hard, negotiating with all the other developers to do that. So like, well, okay, let's create a test net where we can put all our ideas together, and that eventually became Nexa. So Nexa has been an interesting exercise for me because it allowed me to go back to first principles and ask myself, well, if I was recreating Bitcoin with everything I know today, what would I change? And that's so that's the approach we're taking with Nexa. Nexa is just our version of a better Bitcoin.
Yeah. So the personal opinion, I think that's kind of the approach. People with network effects are good, but I think that people should. It does sort of pay me to think about people making trade-offs for political reasons that are more than just as minor trade-offs, like significant trade-offs. And personally, that's what's kind of kept me sort of on the sidelines of the Bitcoin debate. Has been this big specter of trying to be Bitcoin while you're trying to be better, and I'd rather just try to be better. So I do kind of, I do kind of resonate with that idea. So Nexa, I'm assuming it's a proof of work mined blockchain, and UTXO. And what are some other characteristics?
I guess there's Nexa how it is right now, and Nexa how we want to get to it, like after the next hard fork. So I'll talk about my ideal version of Nexa that fixes all of the problems I see with Bitcoin. And I wrote an article about this that maybe you can link your viewers to. So I think we need three and a half changes. So the first change is we want the proof of work to not just be dumb SHA-256 hashing. We want the proof of work to exercise the same computational pipeline as transaction validation. So if you look at how much improvement happened in SHA-256 hashing, it's amazing. Like the difference between Satoshi's CPU mining and a current ASIC miner is a factor of 600,000 times more energy efficient. So an ASIC miner can perform 600,000 times more SHA-256 hashing per joule of energy as Satoshi's original CPU miner. And that's all because, there was this crazy arms race, like you said, for mining to develop better and better and better technology for mining. So what we want to do with Nexa is apply that same economic incentive to improving the node itself. So if we make mining one-to-one with transaction validation, all these miners that are trying to compete with other mining in the arms race of POW, well, they have to, develop more efficient miners. But the algorithm is such that the side effect of that is they also become more efficient transaction validators because our proof of work algorithm is basically transaction validation in disguise.
Yeah, interesting. So it just kind of combines the basic network throughput with like hash rate security, kind of makes them the same thing as opposed to two separate things you're having to juggle.
Yeah. So let me go a bit deeper here. So SHA-256, like normal mining, is miners are always they're just doing SHA-256 over and over and over again until they find the magic knots that solves the difficulty problem. So it's the same thing in Nexa, except they're not using SHA-256. They're using a custom algorithm, which I have written in that paper I just talked about. And that algorithm does two important things. It does elliptic curve point multiplication, and that's the computational bottleneck for verifying a digital signature. And it also does a UTXO set lookup. So those are the two big bottlenecks to scaling. And every hash a miner makes, they have to exercise those two bottlenecks. So any ASIC they make is also an ASIC that's immediately usable for the node itself for performing signature verification and for managing the UTXO set.
Yeah, that does make sense. It is kind of interesting, and because of ASICs, etc., changing hashing algorithms is always kind of a contentious topic on chains that are already very entrenched. And so it is kind of interesting how even like the major Bitcoin forks use the same hashing algorithm. And as far as I know, including eCash, use the same hashing algorithm. And despite the massive security vulnerabilities that could give from, maybe an aggressive BTC miner trying to do something.
Yeah, it's weird why more people haven't fooled around with different proof of works. Like Eric Wall made a post a couple days ago about how you can kind of view humans creating microchips as like bacteria. You throw mining at them, and then they'll just spontaneously make these really, really fast, efficient computer chips if the incentives are right. And we saw that with Bitcoin. Like it's amazing how efficient we've got SHA-256 hashing. Like it really is. If we could throw that same, even a tenth of that, to solving the transaction validation, then we're laughing.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to do with Nexa. We want to take that economic incentive that POW already gives us and funnel that to something a bit more useful. Which is transaction validation.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like the primed to keep the scalability the max possible. It is kind of interesting because how there's always like the chicken or the egg type situation with a lot of like mass scalability chains where you end up, you try to build scalable things and you test it, on testnet or whatever, or do a stress test on mainnet to make sure it works. but then you don't really run into that incentive to keep on making it better until you actually run into the usage, the actual
Yeah.
organic throughput. And so you kind of, the scaling might hit in like waves where you figure a certain level and then you have a bunch of customers, and then eventually they become angry customers because stuff stops working and you have to go back and re-engineer to grow again.
Right, I agree with what you said, but I think you could take it one step further and look at what happened with BTC. So we ran into the scaling bottlenecks, the capacity of Bitcoin Core, but instead of doing what you said and just making it better, people just said, well, it's impossible. So they said
Yeah.
we can't have bigger blocks because we can't do it, but we could have. It just was a chicken and egg, like you said. But instead, they just said because we can't do it now, we can't do it ever. So this idea, it forces them to create the technology before it's ever needed. So there'll be no excuse not to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And so hopefully you never even hit a bottleneck.
Yeah.
Random one other question that popped in my mind, and it's a little bit scatterbrained on all this stuff. What do you think generally about algorithmic block size as opposed to like a flexible, adaptable block size as opposed to a fixed block size? And so specifically, like I know Monero has an adaptable block size, and I think Bitcoin Cash has either has adopted or is exploring an adaptable block size. It basically would increase it would automatically increase if there's a certain amount of traffic, a certain amount of throughput on the network, as opposed to just the blocks are as big as the transactions could fit, even if there's a giant rush. Have you given much thought to the difference between those two general approaches of just make the block size limit able to be as big as it needs, or to keep it constrained but automatically algorithmically grow as traffic grows?
I mean, I don't think anyone has a really good answer to what's best here. I'm of the view that the block size limit should be normally much higher than demand. Like I think I mean, a lot of people will disagree with me, but I think on average you want your blocks to not be totally full. So you want you don't want to be hitting the block size limit on a regular basis. The block size limit should only be hit, if there's like a crazy DOS attack where people are spamming the network, or if there's like some mad rush because someone launched a new meme coin or something. So that's my opinion, and if that is your opinion, then it hardly matters how you adjust the block size limit as long as it stays above the average block size. But if you're of the opinion that no, we want the block size limit to be below where the block size would naturally be to increase fee pressure, then that's a much more hard problem to solve, because now suddenly the demand for block space increases, and we see as on BTC the fees go from like a couple pennies to like $30, and that to me that's terrible. I think that's a very bad user experience, and it breaks things like lightning. But I don't know how, that's a much harder problem to solve. But I don't really care because I don't think we need to solve that problem.
Yeah, that does make sense. Yeah, well, I figured it was worth throwing that out there. This has been quite the enlightening conversation. Where would you point people to, follow your work and find out more about all this good stuff?
I would say, follow me on Twitter. My handle is the same as my name, Peter Rizun. And then my pinned post on my profile is the article that I've been talking about. It kind of describes, my view of what a better Bitcoin is, and I talk about basically 3.5 changes I would make. That's it, to Satoshi's Bitcoin, that I think basically makes a perfect cryptocurrency. If I'm brave enough to say the word perfect. And then there's also a video where I give the talk about that paper at a recent conference in Australia. So if you're interested in learning more about what I talked here, read that article or watch that video.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, yeah, it's been really great chatting with you, and thanks. I've been wanting to talk for a while, and this is not disappointed. This is a lot of light bulbs will go off from this one.
Yeah, I had a great time. I think we covered some interesting areas, and this is the first time I've been on a podcast where I've actually gone this deep into these topics like hardware scalability and the parallelizability between account models and UTXO models. These are really interesting topics that I believe deserve more
Hmm.
mind share from the broader community. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks a bunch.